Last month, someone by the name of Mariana Martin 1661 said, "A video on cover art is definitely something I'm interested in. Thanks for the great content, super helpful." Well, this video is for Mariana and anyone like her who's trying to create their podcast cover art. I'm going to share with you the exact workflow that I use with clients or with the students in the Emerging Voices Podcasting Accelerator that I run. By the end of this video, you should feel super confident that you have everything that you need to get started on your cover art. My name's Huete. If you're new here, I'm a podcast producer and the creator of the Emerging Voices Podcasting Accelerator. I've worked on shows like Where Should We Begin with Esther Perel or This Is Dating, which was listed as one of Time Magazine's best podcasts of 2022. I've also made shows like Far Flung for TED or Together Apart for the New York Times with Priya Parker. And if you're someone who's trying to create their own podcast, you will appreciate my 10-step guide to launching your podcast, which you can download by using the link below. All right, let's get into your podcast cover art. So step number one is defining your podcast's identity. If you try to approach your podcast art by first thinking about colors and fonts and things like that, you might end up with a podcast that doesn't actually reflect what your show is really about. So the first two things you want to figure out are who is this podcast for and what is this podcast about? So if the show centers you, your personality, and if it's really more about your personal brand and your personal ethos that is going to drive the rest of the show, then maybe it makes sense for you to include your face in the cover art. Or you might be someone who's thinking, hey, you know what? This podcast is really just a content marketing tool for the business that I'm creating, and my face has nothing to do with it. If that's the case, you are going to want to lean on your business brand and what it represents and the fonts and the colors that come with that, okay? So as an example, one of my friends, Kiran Yoliswa, is a coach. She helps people using neuroscience and creativity and understanding their own identities to create a career that feels deeply fulfilling for them. And her ideal clients are people who are clearly highly capable, but are just stuck in their careers and don't quite know how to figure out their next steps. Okay, so when we were making her show, we needed to get super clear on those two details, who she was and who the show was for, before we could create this cover art, which we'll talk about in the rest of this video, okay? So number one, figure out your show identity before you do anything else. This is a foundational step. Do not skip it. Step number two is to brainstorm inspiration. Now, when people ask me to brainstorm, I get really overwhelmed because I'm like, there's so many places we could go with this, but you do not want to brainstorm in a vacuum. You want to make a list of 5 of the podcasts that you find really alluring. Maybe they're in your niche, maybe they're not. Just put images of the podcast that you are really drawn to on a Google Doc and start there. And then you want to ask yourself these questions. So first, what exactly are you drawn to? Is it the typography? Is it the colors? What is it about this art that draws you in? You should be clear about that so that you start getting a clear sense about what you're into and what you're not. And usually if we can use something else as a reference, it's easy for us to identify what we like and what we don't like. You also want to ask yourself, is the host's face on the cover? Is that something that you like, or does that turn you away? Is that something that you want to repeat or not quite? What is the style of this cover art? Is it more illustration? Is it a clean image? Get clear on how you would describe the style and whether that is reflective of the kind of style that you want for your particular cover art. And most importantly, what do you want your listener to feel when they come to your show? So I know it can be really easy to be like, empowered, excited, happy, sad. These are words that we hear often and repeat to ourselves often, but I encourage you to dig a little deeper. I actually go on feelingswheel.com and I look through all of the detailed emotions that could exist for my potential listener before I come up with the easiest answer. And part of why you're doing this is because you want to feel really tapped into the psychology of the person that you are creating for. And the whole point behind us caring about emotions is partly because we're human beings and we connect through emotions, but also because you want to base your podcast cover art on the emotions that you want to evoke. So if you want somebody to feel really calm and serene, maybe you use a light blue with some shades of white in between. If you want somebody to be really activated and energized, maybe there's some reds in there that you want to introduce on your podcast cover art. So if you look up color psychology, color theory, that's going to give you tons of information on what colors to pair with certain emotions. Step number 3 is that you want to get super clear on the technical requirements. Now, this is where we're not going to play around. We need the details to be top, okay? Here's the thing. If you don't get these details right, Apple might actually just reject your podcast from being on their platform. And honestly, I love that kind of standard, okay? Just, they said, here are the boundaries, stay within it or don't. So here are the details. I want you to write this down and save it somewhere. You can also take a screenshot, okay? So your cover art must be 3000 by 3000 pixels. The format should be JPEG or PNG. The color space should be RGB, but that, if you're using something like Canva or Adobe, that is naturally what the color space is going to be. So I wouldn't worry so much about that if you're a beginner doing this. I just tell you that in case you're working with a designer. You want to keep all critical information like your name, the podcast name, anything like that above the bottom fifth of the podcast cover art, okay? And technically, you actually want the outer margins to be clean and have no text around them. And that's just because it makes your design look really clean. But also, some podcast players will actually put the player button on the bottom fifth. So you don't want your cover art to get distorted by the platform that it's being listened on. And finally, you want the resolution to be high, but you might need to compress it if the file size is too big. Now, this is if you take a really high quality photo and you create something in, say, Canva or Adobe, and the file is bigger than 1 megabyte, for example, it might say, oh, we can't upload this. So what you want to do is go on a platform like tinypng.com to actually compress your file without losing the resolution. All right, so make sure that these details are taken care of before you try to create the art and upload it to Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you want your podcast to exist. I will say one pro tip here is I will always download the cover art and put it on my phone and just scroll through in my camera roll to see how it sits as a small image. If I can still read the words, then I know it's going to be really easy to see when it's on a podcast on a phone. So that's always what you're really trying to optimize for. You want to make sure that someone who's seeing your podcast for the first time on their phone can actually see the cover art, see what it's about, and decide whether they're going to get into it or not pretty quickly. Step number 4 is to apply key design principles, okay? So this is really where your podcast cover art is going to start to shine. Now, the first thing you want to remember is that less is more. So your title, you want to keep to 5 words or less. The colors, you want to keep 2 to 3 max. And if you do this, it's going to minimize the clutter that is going to show up on your cover art. And on this topic, you want to keep your background pretty clean. So if there are lots of moving pieces, it's going to be hard for your listener to know where to focus, and they're going to want to swipe away. On the same topic, we want your typography or your font to be really bold and clean. It should be really simple and easy for your listener to read the title on a phone. And if it's too small to read on a phone, then it doesn't quite work and you want to keep tweaking it, okay? You also want to avoid any cliche imagery. So we don't need to see that you're wearing headphones and that you have a microphone. It's obvious that it's a podcast because we are finding you on a podcasting platform, okay? Now, I actually am considering making this show a podcast. And so I have a microphone in my image and I think it works, but you can tell me. If not, leave a comment and tell me if you don't love it, and I'm happy to change it. But I think if you're going to use something like a podcast mic or headphones, it needs to be specific to you. It needs to make sense why you're doing that, because it just can't be that you're hosting a podcast. The other piece is you want to make sure that you leave the outer 10% of the cover art clean. Okay, so the 10% margin on the edges is basically around 300 pixels on either side that you want to make sure doesn't have any text around it. I can show you what that looks like on Canva. Because this is 3000 by 3000 pixels, the outer 10th is going to be 300 pixels. So you want about 300 pixels worth of space where you don't have any text on all sides. And then you want to test it in both light and dark mode on a phone. So you just download the image, put it on your camera app, and see when you set your phone to dark mode, does it still show up and is it still legible? If you find that it's not, then you are going to want to tweak some things so that it is. And as an example of all of these key design principles being followed, let's look at Kieran's. Her text is really clear and legible. All important text is inside the 10% line. You can see her image cleanly. There are only a few colors. The title is less than 5 words, and there is not a lot happening in her background. Now, to actually create the cover art, you're gonna need to use the right tools. I personally use Canva because I just think it's the easiest platform to use. There are templates on there, and then if you decide to use their AI integrations, you can do that too. You can see here that I just decided to change the background on a podcast cover art image, and it looks completely different than the original, and I think I like it more, and I think I might actually use it. So even if I'm working with a designer, I'll usually start on Canva because I just think it's the most user-friendly. If you know a lot about design or you're accustomed to other platforms like Photoshop or Adobe Express, then you can totally use those platforms. There are also other template-based platforms like Stencil or Snappa that people have told me are really good. I've personally never used them. What I have tried are the AI art generators that are supposed to be really good for podcast cover art, like Jellypod or Starry AI, or even, I think it's called CV. My thing is, I either didn't like the art or I found that it was way too complicated and they required a lot for someone who was just coming up with an idea and testing their idea. So my personal recommendation is Canva, just because I think that's the simplest place to start. Now, if you're like, listen, I'm not gonna be messing with this on my own, then I highly recommend that you use something like Fiverr or Upwork. I personally have never gotten artwork from Fiverr that I have loved. I've always had to tweak it myself, but I know that a lot of people do use Fiverr and they have really great results. If I were to use a designer on Fiverr or Upwork, something I would ask them to do is give me a format that can live on Canva so that if I wanted to change anything, I could. And actually, the design for the 10-step guide to launching your podcast, someone on Fiverr made it, and then I asked them to put it on Canva, and then I tweaked it myself. So my recommendation is, if you're not working with someone who has a ton of experience in making cover art, then you can play around with it on your own. But again, Canva, I think, should get you 90% of the way there, because not only do they have templates, they have AI integrations that make this super easy. Now, the final thing I'll tell you is when you're making your cover art, just remember that while it's the very first impression that people will have of your show, the next thing they're gonna do is they're gonna click on the image and you need to have a really strong description. So I really urge you to write a keyword-rich description. So you wanna think about what your listener might type into Apple or Spotify to find your show. And you need to have those words in the description of your podcast. So my recommendation is to not think of your podcast art as complete until it's paired with a really rich show description. So there you have it. These are all of the steps that I would take to create new podcast cover art. And many of the students in our accelerator have used these steps to create their cover art. So Alicia created this podcast cover art, Simone created this one, Liz and Christian created this one. And if you are someone who's ready to start your podcast, download your 10-step guide to launching your show, and I will see you in the next video.